A good bit of what I'm going to share with you about this gospel, I gleaned from a commentary on it by Catholic priest Father John McKinnon. He's a priest of the Archdiocese of Bellerod in West Victoria. He studied in Rome. He was ordained in 1957, and at the age of 75, he retired, and he works with the ongoing education of priests, religious, and laity. Now, he explains this at the beginning. He says, the parable, all the parables of Jesus, but the parable, especially this one, was used to illustrate the way things happen between God and humanity. Mention of ordinary kings immediately served to put the hearer on alert. Values in God's kingdom were quite different from the ways of earthly kingdoms. So rather than compare, the point would be better understood as contrasted. A lot of times he did this in his teaching. He said, you've heard it said, what I say to you is. And so the parable was not so much simply used to illustrate the way things happen between God and humanity, but as Jesus told parables, he intended them not so much to illustrate something like the tortoise and the hare in Aesop's fables. The conclusion is, strong and steady wins the race. But Jesus had parables to challenge and to stimulate people to a deeper reflection when they heard the story. For instance, when he talks about, a man was beset by robbers going from Jerusalem to Jericho, who was neighbor to the man? And they would say, well, the one who treated him with kindness. Go and do likewise. And so here we have this story. Now, what we do not know, and I had not known this until I happened to come across this, it's a tiny footnote, in the Bible. And the translation we have today is, he came upon a servant, who owed him a huge sum, a huge amount. Now, unless you actually look at the little, and I never noticed this before, the little asterisk next to that verse, and then go down, and it describes that literally, what was translated as a huge amount was literally translated in the original language as 6,000 denarius. It's a man who owed 6,000 talents. 6,000 talents. I messed this up again. I'm sorry. I've done this at two masses and I'm still messing it up. Remember, I just learned about this. Okay. As he began the reckoning, one was brought to him who owed a huge amount, but the original language said 10,000 talents. There, I've got it. 10,000 talents. Now, the problem is, whenever we think of currency and we hear a figure, we tend to translate it in our minds as sort of like, okay, the main unit of currency, a talent's got to be like $1. So 10,000 talents has got to be like $10,000. Nope. A talent was the largest unit of currency at the time. It was equal, here's where I got confused about the 6,000. 1 talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. Now, a denarius was a Roman silver coin equal to a day's wages for a skilled laborer. So if 1 denarius was what a person like the ungrateful servant, who was a skilled administrator, if 1 denarius was what somebody could earn in a day, he would need to work 6,000 days to earn 1 talent. 1 talent was worth 6,000 days of labor. 10,000 talents equaled how much? 60 million denarius, or 60 million days of work. And I was stumbling with this. I was trying to figure out, okay, so many hours in a day, 8 hours of labor in a day, okay, 40-hour week, 7-day labor, 7 days of labor, 1 day of rest. Anyway, it would take more than 450 years of work to cover this sum. So here's what happens. Jesus telling the story, ordinary things. People are in debt. They owe somebody money. Anybody owe anybody money today? Yeah, I didn't think so. And what happens is it comes up with a huge amount, something you can't even wrap your brain around, unimaginable. The guy owed 60 million denarii. 60 million. I don't even know if they had any reason to count to a million back then. So what happens is the parable really ends after the guy has had his entire debt erased, is walking down the street, sees somebody who owes him a smaller sum. The guy who came upon the one who had everything forgiven owed 100 days' wages. Now, depending upon the work, that would be either 3 or 4 months' work of work, but it could be paid back. And he says, be patient with me, I'll pay you back, and the man has none of it. And so, here's part of the problem. Put yourself in the position of the guy who got so far in debt. Now, how did he do it? Obviously, he was skimming from the king's wealth. There's no other way he could have amassed that kind of quantity of money, except he was really into money, really into stealing. The king has so much he'll never notice it. The king noticed it. Now, you would think that on his way back, he would be really, really happy, that he got let off the hook, merely because the king was merciful. If you won the Powerball or Mega Millions, okay, and you're at your house, you look like you realize you just won, and your child comes in and says, I'm really sorry, but I crashed the car. You probably would go, don't worry about it. You're good. Cars can be replaced. We can do that. That is not a problem. But this was a problem for this man who couldn't find it in his heart to even just be grateful for what the king had done for him. And you would have thought it would have changed how he looked upon things. And so, the parable really should end with, you wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt. Should you not have done the same? However, what happened is, by the time the gospel was written, Matthew adds another verse, which says, in his rage, the master then handed him over to the torturers until he repaid the whole debt. And thus that will happen to you if you do not forgive your sister or brother from your heart. Now, the problem with that is, God is all merciful. And if Jesus is telling a story about the capacity of the Father's forgiveness, which is greater than the capacity of earthly kings, then if this parable ends with the threat of punishment and destruction and torture, God is not living up to what Jesus is actually telling other people to live up to. So it really is something that is not sensible from the point of God's forgiveness. It only makes sense from the point of the community. Because the community would say, well, you just can't forgive. Just can't forgive. Someone has to show they're sorry. What happens if you forgive everything? You become a doormat. People walk all over you. No. There has to be payback. There has to be justice. So that's the problem when we look at what this parable is asking us to do. It's saying, look, God forgives everything. God forgives everything. Your whole life. No matter what you've done, no matter what, sorrow it brought to people or to yourself, God can forgive you because he's God. Like the king could forgive the huge sum, the impossible sum, the unimaginable sum, because he is the king and he has all this wealth at his command. God has all this love in his heart for you and me. And if you think about it, it's the reason why somebody died on the cross. I mean, Jesus, why did he die on the cross? Because we couldn't save ourselves. The offense against God was an offense that only could be taken away from someone like God. And so that's why he sent his only begotten Son. We could not save ourselves. Only God could do that by sending his Son to us to forgive without limit. So why do we find it difficult to forgive? Here's what Father McKinnon said. He says over and over again, Jesus urged disciples to forgive. Now he says, those who've been significantly hurt can view forgiveness as a much too generous concession. Those who have been significantly hurt can view forgiveness as a much too generous concession. And the reality is, it's not possible to simply say, for major offenses, oh, I forgive you. You have to work through that. It's like grieving or mourning. When you have a terrible loss of a child or a spouse or a family member, you don't just say immediately, well, I know they're in heaven, I'll be fine. You work through it. When someone injures you seriously, you may want to say, I forgive you, but the point is, it takes time. It can't be empty words. I forgive you. And then you just hoard it, carry it within your heart, remembering it over and over and over again. That's why the first reading says, wrath and anger are hateful things. They don't help us. And so, he says, now those who have been significantly hurt can view forgiveness as a much too generous concession, but the truth is, everyone in the community is in constant situation of needing to receive forgiveness as well as to give it. Forgiveness is a constituent element of the Christian community's flow of life. Since we ourselves are imperfect and we live in an imperfect world, then the Lord's Prayer to be forgiven as we forgive others is a regular reminder to each disciple. So why forgive? Now, by the way, he makes a difference between sins against us that are deliberate and things that are involuntary or accidental. Somebody uses a word, it strikes you the wrong way. You get very upset and angry, you say the wrong thing. You overreact. You find words coming out of your mouth that relate to a whole history of injuries that you've kept bottled up. And then when the straw breaks the heart's back, you then let it all out. And that gives nothing but destruction to both people. It injures both souls. And once certain words are said, in truth, they can never really be unheard. So forgiveness is a requirement if we are to stay in God's love and be able to give God's love. He says, why is that so important to forgive? He says, unforgiveness destroys open communication and undermines respect, care, and love. Now, he does say something interesting. He says, those suffering wrong are open to grace because their hearts are broken. Those suffering wrong are open to grace, and so they are open to respond to God's empowerment. When we find ourselves, at wit's end, we then drop all our defenses and begin to say, now what? How am I going to get out of this? What's the next step? What are we going to do? And so he says, those suffering wrong are open to grace. Now, interesting, he says, those doing wrong have closed off from grace. He says, theologically, it's easier to forgive someone else than to be sorry for what you've done. Isn't that intriguing? It's easier to forgive somebody else than be sorry for what you've done. And why is that? Because they deserved it. I know what I said was wrong, but I meant it. They had to hear it. I had no other choice. Well, we always have another choice. We always have another choice. And when we fail because we're imperfect and we live in an imperfect world with imperfect people, we find that when we ponder what our next step is, we realize there's no other choice but to let things go. And that was the end of the parable before Matthew put in the judgment and the threat of violence and torture. Of course, Matthew is very big on judgment. Remember, he has the scene where he says, at the end of the world, when the Son of Man returns, with all the angels escorted by the trailing clouds of glory, the Lord, will gather people together and separate them like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. I was hungry, you gave me to eat, come share your Lord's joy. I was hungry, you didn't give me anything to eat. When did we see you? It was the least of my sisters or brothers that you either helped or neglected. If you helped them, you were helping me. If you neglected them, you were neglecting me. And so that in chapter 25 I think verse 35, shows you part of Matthew's, trying to remind people to, do God's will. Otherwise, there are consequences. But that didn't come from this parable. That came from the Christian communities having to live with serious harm being done to the community. And so at some point, they kept in their minds and in their hearts, if you don't, it's going to be bad for you. Instead of, well, I forgave you everything, the king says to the servant. Shouldn't you have forgiven the other person who owed you a much smaller amount? In which case, people listening to that would have said, yeah, that's right. That's what we should do. Not, that's what I better do or I'm going to get in trouble. It's, yeah, that's what we should do. Because it then helps us reflect back on not the injury that we received, but the limitless capacity of the Father's love. The limitless capacity of the Father's love. Tell you a quick story. I've told you this before, but you might not remember it. One time, I was a young man. I was in, I might have been in high school. I didn't have a car, but our house on our street lives a little bit down the hill, and there's a sharp corner. We're in the house with the windows up because we don't have air conditioning, and TV's on, and we hear squealing, doors slam, squealing tires, and then a crash. The crash was right in front of the house. My father gets out, I get out. There's a young man about my age, and his car is smashed into my father's car. I'm looking. My father looks, and he goes, go call the police. So he goes, we go in to call the police, I come back out. But this time he's talking to the kid, and the kid says, my father says, what happened? He says, I had a fight with my girlfriend. She lives up the street on the next road over. I was so mad. I burned rubber coming out of there, and I wasn't familiar with the turn, and I lost control of the car. So then the police came. Guess what my father did? They said, did you hear anything? He says, I heard the crash. Didn't see anything about squealing tires or burning rubber. He says, what do you think happened? He says, well, there's only one street light here. That other one is out. If you're not familiar with the neighborhood, you're not going to really know what's happening on the road. And he says, well, what do you think? And he says, it was just an accident. So I heard my father say this to this young man. And after the boy left and the police left, went into the house, and I said, Dad, why'd you do that? He says, when I was talking to the boy while you were going in to have your mother call the police, he was crying, and he said, I can't go home, I can't go home, I can't go home. My father said, why can't you go home? He says, my father's going to kill me. And then my father said, imagine being so afraid of your father that you couldn't go home. And so he didn't press anything. The insurance would take care of it. There's no reason for him to try to get the kid in any more trouble than what he faced when he got home. I remember sitting there listening to my father say this. This was decades and decades ago. And the thought came to me, where did this man come from? Because I didn't realize that my father felt so highly about the relationship between a son and a father. A lot of what I heard from my father was, expectations with regard to this is what you should do, these are the grades you should get, this is how I expect you to act. And a lot of it, you don't talk to your mother that way. Look at people when they're talking to you, say you're sorry. And so I just really thought, well, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I thought he was a tough guy, but he was doing it because he wanted me to be a good man. And so everything that I took as criticism was really love. So when we hear from God, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, don't take it as if I don't, I'll get in trouble. Take it as it's the way to live. That's the way we should live. That's the way we need to live. That's the way God wants us to live. And if I want to live as a child of God, that's what I'm going to do too.